Welcome back to the second half of our teleconference on cybernetics. In keeping with the tone of the show, we would like to begin this portion as a question and answer period, but against traditional views of question and answer periods, we would like it to be much more of a dialogic session where the presenters can ask questions of each other. Therefore, I turn the show back over to Professor von Foerster and Maturana to see if each of you has a question for the other.
Indeed. Humberto, I was very fascinated by a particular point in your presentation. I would love whether this could be extended. And this was the notion which you developed when you showed your creature above an environment, and with these two arrows, interaction between the two. And if I recapitulate correctly, you said there might be changes of behavior which be followed by change of the internal physiology, which of course cause again changes of behavior, etc., etc. All noticed by this famous eye which is looking onto these creatures interacting with the environment. When I heard you speaking about that, I thought, are you touching already on notions of evolution? Would this notion be extendable so that it can account for evolution of these creatures? I would be most happy if you could do a little bit more on that.
Very good.
With the permission of the chairman.
Do we have the permission? Yes, certainly it can be handled that way, because what happens is that whenever you have a system, in fact, the system is constituted whenever you have a situation in which there is a boundary established with the production of a domain of interaction. So if you have a boundary such that this interacts in a medium, this becomes, as a result of that boundary, an entity that interacts in a medium, then you have a system, and medium in interaction. And this entity will last as long as these interactions are such that the manner in which it is defined it is conserved. So what in the history of any system happens, what is conserved is a manner of being. It's not a structure. It's not merely the organization that defines its identity, but its interaction in a medium such that this interaction never triggers the disintegration of the system, are always interactions in congruence. So this entails a manner of being, or if you are dealing with living systems, a manner of living. Now, we are not very much aware of this, but this is what defines systems: the conservation of an organization and a relation of correspondence with the medium. And the system is constituted whenever you have such condition in which a unit is established in a particular relation with circumstances which are being conserved. Now, in evolution, in the evolution of living systems, what is being conserved is a manner of living. And different species are defined by the manner of living that is being conserved in a lineage. I call this manner of living that is being conserved in a lineage the ontogenic phenotype, because it has to do with the manner of living from the conception of the organism to its death. Not only the manner of living of one particular moment of its life history, but the whole manner of living of its history.
When you have this arrow, is this implying that there are internal changes taking place or something like that?
Yeah. The drawing should be the following. Here you have a system interacting in a medium. As a result of this interaction, what you have is a structural change triggering the system by the encounter with the medium, and the structural change triggering the medium by the encounter with the system. which results in a further structural change triggered in the system by the encounter with the medium, and a further structural change in the medium triggered by the system.
So the next one could be like this.
The next one could be like that. And possibly with several steps. You
Yes,
would
yes,
get
yes,
like
of
that.
course. I made that.
And if that doesn't happen, then the next one is this.
He was a Christian.
But since those which bury him or her who remain alive, this is a Christian or Muslim according to the others.
Yeah, but no. Is that, look, these transformations which are taking place, is this comparable to that what you call a drift?
Oh, this is a drift.
We were talking about the helmsman
Certainly,
who
certainly.
changes the shape of the boat.
Certainly, this is a drift. You see, this is a drift because what is happening here is that this is not an input. These are not input-output arrows. These are encounters. So in this encounter, the structural changes triggered here determine here in the structure of the system. And the structural changes triggered here determine in the structure of the medium. So system and medium change together.
Yeah.
System and medium change together. This is always the case for any system. I mean, we're here speaking about living system, but this is the case for any system. System and medium change together. And frequently I use the shoes for this because this is almost a daily life experience that you buy a pair of shoes. Now suppose that you are very rich, very, very rich. So you buy 2 pairs of shoes, identical. And you use only one of them. So after 2 years, your shoes have changed according to the use. I mean, these are very comfortable shoes that I have been using for 2 or more years. Now, after 2 years, you decide to use the new shoes, which when you bought were very comfortable, those which you are keeping aside. And when you try them, they are not comfortable as they were originally. And it is because your feet and your shoes have changed together in this history. In the history of the drift of the shoe and the drift of the feet has been congruent.
Co-drifters.
Co-drifters. Now, evolution is a process in which what you have is that each individual life is a drift and there is a reproduction. So you have a succession of individual drifts. And the lineage is defined by the manner of living that is conserved through generations. Now, this is much more clear if you think about a family. Whenever you ask someone, for example, how do you define your family? By the conservation of what? The name. No. The manner of living, a name, for example, von Foerster. The manner of having breakfast. Suppose that you have for breakfast cheese, juice.
Salami, in my case.
Salami in your case.
Salami in my case, yeah.
Salami or cheese?
Salami.
Salami, bread, juice, and eggs. As long as this is conserved generation after generation, the identity of the family is conserved. But if one of your children adds, for example, cheese to breakfast, then now.
Disinherited.
Disinherited. The lineage stops immediately. So this is what evolution is. A history of conservation of manners of living that defines lineages. And the arisal of new lineages when a new manner of conservation when a new manner of living begins to be conserved. Now, notice, I mean, this is a very interesting thing which I'm going to tell to you. As soon as you define a relation that is being conserved, all the rest can change, provided that relation is not altered. As soon as a manner of living is defined that is being conserved, all the rest can change. Isn't that interesting? Evolution is not determined by genetics. It's not the conservation of a genetical constitution, is the conservation of an ontogenic phenotype. The genetics follows the ontogenic phenotype that's being conserved. But this is valid for any system, be a culture, be a family, whatever it is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
At least I'm happy.
Now,
Perhaps you have a question
Yes,
for,
I do.
for Heinz.
Yeah, my question has to do with this historical chart that you have here. You did not speak about Bateson, Löfgren, and Pask.
That is true. Because I wanted to be through in 30 minutes and to give you a chance to talk about the critters interacting with the environment. Yeah, indeed, in the first state of cybernetics, first order cybernetics, when notions became clear to this extraordinary interesting group of developers, philosophers, and thinkers, Gregory Bateson picked up on some of the paradoxical notions which he was referring to usually as the anomaly of judgment. And this is this peculiar situation that if you give people choices, for instance, between A and B, apples and bananas, they may prefer bananas. You give them bananas and cherries, B and C, they prefer the cherries. So apparently the cherries are the far the best. Now you give them the choice between cherries and apples. And they may say, I like the apples. So you prefer B over A, C over B, and A over C. That means the preference of choices go around in circles. So if you tell that to a logician, this is impossible, it's out of this world, preferences is a relation which cannot be symmetrical, is not symmetrical, etc., etc. But Gregory Bateson said, okay, then you logicians have to work out a logic which applies to real people who are doing this kind of choices. Therefore, you have to account now for people who are making choices. What kind of logic is that? So I wanted to point that out, and by the way, if you are very much interested in such notions, Warren McCulloch, in a very, very famous paper, which unfortunately is not very well known, was talking about the hierarchy of values, because he pointed out that exactly this anomaly of choices is built in the function of our nervous system. He developed the notion of hierarchy. I think it was a heterarchy. He was the first one who pointed out that there are other organizational possibilities besides the hierarchy, namely the notion of heterarchy. Heterarchy means the other is ruling. Hierarchy is God, the Holy One, is ruling. So always the commands are coming from top to down. But in a heterarchy, we are relating to each other in our decision mechanism, and in a heterarchy, things may go in a circle. So this was Bateson, but then the paradoxical situation was picked up by Lars Löfgren, the Swedish logician. I will not talk too much about that because Lars's work is perhaps very well known. You can get the literature in the Cybernetic Society. Lars was treating the paradoxical situation head on, and he developed a whole logic which I think is extraordinarily important and not too well known. He calls it auto-logic. It's a logic with all the notions which refer to themselves. These were usually notions which were excluded from philosophical, linguistic, and epistemological argumentation because of being afraid of running into paradoxes. But Lars Löfgren developed the whole notion straightforward through those notions that apply to themselves. And these are the very important notions. For instance, when you talk about Bateson already talking about not only learning, but learning of learning, or consciousness, self-conscious, being conscious about one's consciousness. All the fascinating notions are self-referential notions. They fall into the domain of logic, of autologic. About Maturana, I fortunately do not have to talk because he's representing his own model. And I would like to say a word about Gordon Pask, because he's such an extraordinarily important person. Gordon, I think, recognized very, very early already the necessity of the dialogical situation. That means you only can interact properly by interacting, by having a dialogue. He developed the whole beautiful notion of conversation theory, and I'm very glad that Gordon is here also at this conference and will present his own story. So thank you very much for allowing me to make a few commercials about these fabulous people I have listed here on this graph.
Thank you very much, both of you, for allowing us to shift from questions of what cybernetics is to questions of what cyberneticians do. In a few minutes, we will be opening our telephone lines for questions from all the viewers. If you're in the studio audience here, you can indicate that you have a question by raising your hand. If you're in the teleconference world, if your telephone is in the same room as your television monitor, please lower the volume before making the call, or call from another phone. Let's begin our question and answer session with a question from the audience. The questions from outside the studio audience, by the way, have the telephone numbers again as 1-800-462-0959 and area 804-683-5318. And again, these numbers are for use for this teleconference today. Is there a question in the studio audience then? Okay.
You mentioned that cybernetics should affect what scientists do. How is it that the notions of second-order cybernetics affect the way you practice science? And either one of you can answer that.
There's a question to both of us, or to me?
Yes, to both of you.
To both of us. You see, if we speak about orthodox science, and we spoke about perhaps orthodox science 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, then the essence of a scientist was to be what was called an objective observer. The problem of an objective observer is that his observations, when he describes them, should be completely free of the properties or the views, or the ideas and notions of the observer. So observer and the observed, completely separated. Now, if you look at this claim to objectivity, which is again, of course, a wonderful way of getting out of responsibility, because you are nothing else than, if you are an orthodox observer, than a mouthpiece of that what takes place. And it was essentially the great philosopher and naturalist Helmholtz who postulated this locus observandi, as he called it. A locus, a place outside of the turmoil of what's going on in the universe. He's standing there with a God's eye. He's watching what's going on, and apparently whatever he sees is clearly the thing that is the case, because his eyes, his preoccupation, his language, his way of looking at it do not enter. And you can make a description, so to say, of that, what is the case. And the moment when you begin to realize that this stance is essentially impossible, and these are the points which we already have presented here. First of all, the observer is not a trivial machine. The universe which is observing is not a trivial machine, etc., etc. With all these notions coming in, it became clearer and clearer that this notion of a locus observandi, a place where you're being outside of that what happens, is an impossible place. If I would be given a little bit more time, which would be perhaps a later point in our question and answer series, I could even demonstrate that the notion of observing is essentially a participatory affair. If I do not partake, and I think Maturana's creatures that with these double arrows are already indicating that. It is absolutely impossible to have this notion of a locus observandi. You are, as an observer, always a participant, And as a participant, you are, of course, responsible for that, in which way you are participating. And with this notion, which was introduced in scientific discourse through the gates of cybernetics, the whole notion of science, for those who embrace these notions, has, of course, fundamentally changed. Ellen, did I answer your question in the sense you would hope it would be answered? Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would like to go in a slightly different direction in the answer to this question. First of all, I would like to distinguish between the scientist and science. It's not the same thing. Science is a domain of statements and explanations that some people do who are valid according to particular criterion of validation, which I myself call the criterion of validation of scientific explanation. Now, whenever you have a procedure to obtain something, you as the person that uses the procedure may have desires, wishes, hopes, or whatever it is about the outcome, but the outcome is not the result of your desires, but the result of the procedure. You have a procedure to go to the second floor, which is going upstairs, then you go upstairs and you get to the second floor. You may have wished that you don't find there what you find, but this doesn't matter. You apply the procedure going upstairs, there you get. So that part of doing science is not affected by the fact that the observer is participatory, because it's the procedure. Now, what is affected is what the scientist asks, which questions he or she asks, or what explanatory propositions he or she puts. This is where his or her participation enters fully, because what we scientists explain is not reality, but experience. Now, we may, for many years, we scientists have believed, I myself believed until 1965, that I require the supposition of an independent reality to do science. And then I realized that this is an irrelevant supposition. You can have it or not, and the beauty of irrelevant suppositions is exactly that you can have them or not. It makes no difference. So it is very fundamental, I think, to make this distinction. As you apply the criterion of validation of scientific explanations, whatever you do as a person that applies this is irrelevant. But whenever you ask a question, then it is not irrelevant. It is there where you enter fully as a person. It's there where your preferences, desires, aspirations, fears, ambitions, or whatever it is,
but here comes, I think, may I, Mr. Chairman, to make a comment to that? Because I think there is a fundamental position which one is taking from the very beginning of looking at this problematic. And this is a choice between two attitudes. And the one attitude says, the world is the primary cause, and my experiences are the consequences. Or one can take, my experience is the primary cause, and the world is a consequence of my experiences.
That is true, but the consequences of that will be on the questions that you ask.
Right, but...
and what do you do with the answers that you get?
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that this question is undecidable.
No, that is true, but I agree,
Yeah.
but this requires another reflection.
Right.
Okay, so my answer to the question is that if you consider what scientists do in terms of what validates scientific statements, then this doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
But if you consider what scientists do as human beings, what questions they ask, what consequences they draw from the scientific statement that they can make, then it matters fully.
That matters.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question from the studio audience. Go ahead, please.
This is a question for Professor von Foerster. You very kindly went into where cybernetics came from. I have yet to hear any mention that war had anything to do with the development of cybernetics. command, control, communications, intelligence is an awful lot of what modern warfare is about. Can you give us any enlightenment on that?
You are,
Question was for Professor von Foerster?
yeah, the question is directed at me because I have here this beautiful historical chart.
I was thinking of such authors as Xenophon or Sun Tzu for the ancient or implicit stage of cybernetics.
Depends upon which phase of the history you enter. Of course, war is always affecting anything. But it's the question of how much emphasis you would like to do in the developing of this and developing that. In fact, for instance, if you would like to take the war situation of the Second World War and Norbert Wiener's invitation to develop a mathematics for anti-aircraft gunnery, where you have to understand what's going on with an airplane who would like to escape any kind of an attack by a grounded gun, which is shooting projectiles up into the air. Then you are confronted with the problem of prediction. And this problem of prediction, which Wiener at first, because he was very famous about extrapolation and interpolation of stationary time series, was being asked, Professor Wiener at MIT, can you help us developing computing machinery which would set anti-aircraft guns if we identify the airplane so that we can properly shoot at them. So Norbert Wiener was indeed developing some of those mathematical tools which are necessary to first interpret the movement of the plane, then making extrapolations of the movement of the plane, making guesses as to at which point in time-space this craft would be, where would be the projectile, doing all these calculations and setting the gun appropriately. Indeed, Norbert was doing that. But if you were to say this was the only source of stimulation for cybernetic notions, then this is not the case. Because around the same time, if you were to look at medical profession and neurophysiology, neurology, for instance, Claude Bernard and others, who were having problems of what keeps certain properties in the body constant, sugar level, temperature, etc. What are these mechanisms? And independent of the war effort, these people were already thinking in a very similar direction. It was only happened to be that when Norbert Wiener and these people got together, he had developed the mathematics to deal with problems of that sort. In fact, the most fascinating thing for me is Norbert Wiener, who was indeed engaged in this war effort in the years 1943, 44, etc., turned away completely in course of his life, addressed his mathematical knowledge and know-how, the notion of cybernetics, to the idea of prostheses, either motor prostheses, sensory prostheses for the blind, for those who couldn't hear, for people with artificial limbs, etc. He was developing his skills and his notions with Mexican neurophysiologist Arturo Rosenbluth to develop devices of such sort. Indeed, I mean, responding to your question, I think with a little bit of a historical detail.
Thank you. We have next a phone-in question from Virginia Beach. Please go ahead, Virginia Beach.
I would like to ask either of the panelists if they would comment on some of the cybernetic implications of Buddhism and meditation. In meditation, you have mind reflecting on mind. The observer watching his own thought processes is the basis of a entire ethical system. Enlightenment seems to be the discovery of the non-existence of a separate observer or any kind of ego. That leads to the ending of suffering. I know Bateson was interested in some of those ideas. If you had any thoughts on that.
Virginia Beach, I would like to make the following comment. It's a very important point, and I think in my very, very first statement, I made the 3 levels of circularity. One was the standard notion A acting on B, B on C, and C back on A, and then the reflexive reference, where A is causing B, B is back on A, but then the shortest loop of reference when A is acting on A. And the meditation process is essentially that, where you act upon yourself. And this is not very easy because you are so much aware of constantly acting on something else that to cut the something else off and concentrate on yourself, establishing the A to A loop is a real skill. And I think in the meditation situation, you are learning to develop that skill. That's for the moment my response, but Humberto, I'm sure you have another one.
Yes, I would like to, forgive me, you see, I am a professor, so I always come to the whiteboard. What you have in an organism, you have this nervous system, and the nervous system is a closed network. It's a network of relations of activity between components that are interconnected in such a way that any change of relation of activity between one part of the network results in changes of activity in the rest of the network. Now, meditation takes place only after you have organisms that operate in language. It doesn't take place between non-languaging organisms. It cannot take place because in order for meditation to take place, or any reflection, by the way, what is necessary is to have developed a dynamics such that the circular dynamics of the nervous system operates as recursive. Now, circular operation is not recursive. What makes circular operation recursive is an association with another circumstance such that the circular operation becomes historical, so that an observer can claim that in the circularity, the reapplication of the circularity is on the consequence of its previous application. And that, in the nervous system, can only take place if there is a languaging history. So meditation cannot take place without a languaging history. And in that sense, is fundamentally not different from any reflection. What is peculiar, of course, is what you do for meditation. What dynamic do you enter in this particular disposition that you adopt? But you can perform that dynamic only to the extent that you are a languaging being, such that you have developed a history of transformation of your nervous system, a history of transformation of your nervous system contingent to languaging, which allows you recursive operation in your nervous system.
Ask that because, stay for a second. What interests me a great deal lately is legitimizing the notion of introspection. In fact, we are constantly introspecting, only that it is usually because of this claim of objectivity, usually being condemned as being personal, bias, blah, blah, blah. Would there be a step exactly in this domain for the legitimization of introspection?
Yes. You see, introspection is a phenomenon that can take place only after you are social in language.
Correct.
This is the point of recursion or repetition. To claim that a particular operation is recursive, you must, is something that the observer says. No operation is recursive in itself. Recursion has to do with the association of two domains such that what happens in one is referred to another one which is historical, such that you can claim that the operation is applied on its consequences. Because if you cannot claim that, then you cannot claim that there is recursion and there is no recursion. By the way, the same for repetition. You say, I'm not applying the operation on the consequences, but on the same thing that I applied before. I'm repeating. This is again a statement made by an observer in a comparison of two domains. So the nervous system is a circular system. In fact, it's a network of circular processes.
Thank you.
And for those circular processes to be recursive, you require this history of association, and you get that in language. So only after language you can make self-reflection or meditation and things of this sort.
Okay. We have a question from Norfolk, Virginia. Will you go ahead, please, Norfolk?
This is a question for both the speakers, and to follow up, in a sense, the reference to Norbert Wiener. In fact, after the war, he rather loudly renounced military research, and I'm now asking this question as a young scientist starting in a university setting where it seems that research is very important, and where I don't have the tenure to take the luxury, it seems to me, of renouncing funding sources, especially in cybernetics, for much of it could come from the military. I know that both the speakers have dealt with rather dicey situations, and I would appreciate their views on this and ways to proceed.
If you ask me, who is now retired for about 15 years and almost 80 years of age, I'm disconnected with all funding sources. So I do not know, that means all my knowledge about fundology are inapplicable because they fit to an entirely different time. You people, you young people, I do not envy you at all to get funded for fundamental research, because fundamental research is looked upon with a jaundiced eye. All the major foundations who indeed should have picked up the responsibility where the other governmental funding agencies have failed us in their social responsibility doing that. So I must say, if you ask me, I'm desperate. I admire your courage to go after that. The only thing I can say is don't give up. Try to twist the arms of the big boys who are sitting on the billions and spend it for nonsense. This is, as I say, is a confessional. I do not know how to answer. I only admire and wish you very good luck.
Yeah. Very well. I myself also am not funded by any agency. I was, for a while, doing research and supported by the American Air Force. I'm very grateful for that. But I must confess that I have been hypocritical all my life. And I think that we most scientists are. We promise something and do something else.
This is not hypocritical. This is just doing something else.
Okay, but you see, I'm not ashamed of saying this because I think we do this. But I think that there is a fundamental responsibility in what one does, and this I do not wish to pretend that I do not have. Yeah. I know that what I do will be used or is used in one way or another, and then I must decide whether I want or do not want the consequences of my doings. So I think that this is the criterion that eventually one has to have. At the same time, I know that whenever one does something sufficiently seriously, people want to support this. But I myself prefer not to be supported by any demand which has to do with war. I think that war and competition are completely antisocial, so I don't like them.
Okay. We also have a call-in question from the former home of the Biological Computer Laboratory, where many of these conversations have taken place in the past, at the University of Illinois at Urbana. Go ahead, please, University of Illinois.
Okay. This is Ricardo Uribe, and I would like to salute Heinz and Humberto, first of all. And second, here is the question. There is a resistance, even perhaps a fear, to accept circularity and paradox. Which are the roots of this resistance, and how can it be overcome? This question is for both Heinz and Humberto.
The usual resistance to the notion of paradox stems, of course, from a purely orthodox position. The famous way of arguing against that is not arguing against that at all, because you will get nowhere. The point is to undermine the position. This is essentially, I think, done by the arguments by G. Spencer Brown. For instance, Spencer Brown's argument where functions may enter their own domain, etc., is a very straightforward mathematical argument which would eliminate the notion of paradox as a hostile thing, as an unacceptable thing, but allow paradox to enter the orthodox domain by furnishing a dynamics. You may argue, Ricardo, that, for instance, a paradox is built in every machine that has a clock, because a 0 is generating a 1, a 1 is generating a 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1. This is exactly the paradoxical state of affairs, where true is generating false, false generating true, etc., etc. Well, this is a psychological approach where you say, look, every good computer which has a clock built in, every wristwatch which is run by a little crystal, is working on a paradoxical apparatus because it generates 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1 in a very sequential form. There are probably deeper-seated problems, and the deeper-seated problems, I think, still have to do with the notion of objectivity. Namely, if you embrace a notion of objectivity, then of course you say, here is an independent and absolutely independent universe. For me, here it is, and we have to describe it. This is a deeper-seated problematic because you are moving away from the notion of what is the descriptive problem. You are going back to the problem of truth. And that is, of course, the same problem which Aristotle had when he was confronted with Epimenides' paradox, where it says, when I assume I'm speaking the truth, the liar, he is lying. And when he is lying, he's speaking the truth. It is exactly this difficulty which is confronted by these people. In both cases, and now I have to talk about a therapist, how do you heal this deficiency in thinking, looking, perception? You cannot approach it head-on. You must think of how to undermine. And undermining is not by you doing anything. Let them undo themselves. You just help the undoing. You don't fight it.
Can I say, please? I think that there is another aspect in addition to what Heinz has said, which is this, on the one hand, this desire of certainty, to be sure of what one claims. And the other one has to do with this basic reductionist attitude that one has when one believes there is a fundamental truth, reality, in which one wants to flatten everything into one domain. Now, in daily life, if you say, oh, don't believe me, all Chileans are liars, well, you may believe me or not, but nobody is troubled by that as a paradox. In daily life, you're not troubled by that. Just, oh, well, so we don't have to believe Chileans, don't believe Chileans. I mean, we Chileans always lie. One accepts that as a legitimate statement in daily life now. But in daily life, one is not concerned with truth. In daily life, one is concerned with coordinating one's life with other people in doing things. So you mean that if I go to Chile, I should not believe, no, whenever they say that this costs so much, you must immediately ask for a reduction of price because certainly costs less than that. You bargain, because they will never tell you the true value of whatever it is. So the question, the paradox arises only when you begin to be concerned with truth. And only when you begin to be concerned with the absolute truth. Because then you do not accept many legitimate domains. Because if you accept several legitimate domains, then you know, in this domain, this is the case, in this other domain, this is the case, and never a paradox arises. But whenever you know in daily life that a statement is valid, and another statement that applies to another domain is also valid, but you want them to be valid in a single domain, then you have a paradox. So this is always a reductionist situation.
May I make a point? This question from Illinois started with a personal note, greeting Humberto and me. I would like to respond with a personal note, greeting our friend Ricardo Uribe, and love and greetings to your family. Thanks for coming up and asking the questions.
We have time for one more brief question from the audience up front.
Yes, my question is to Professor Maturana. One of the major points that you were making was to focus on understanding as opposed to prediction. And in looking at in your discussion of evolution, you talked about how that was focusing on understanding. And when I was thinking back to your discussion of the helmsman, it seemed like a very different situation, because when you're talking about the helmsman, now the observer is within the system, whereas looking at evolution, the observer was outside the system. And the helmsman is making a prediction about how he changes the shape of the boat will affect the drifting that's going on.
Yes, I thank you. This is an interesting question, because the understanding I'm proposing to you can only arise once you have accepted that you are a participant observer. And you accept that you are a participant observer in the moment in which you accept the idea that when you explain the nervous system and cognition, you are explaining yourself. Now, as long as you remove yourself and believe that you have this ability to know and to explain, then you can operate with the nervous system as traditionally one does, as an open system that receives information from the environment, and you have input and output relations and so on and so forth. But when you apply that to the conditions of constitution of observing, of language, it doesn't work. So in the moment in which you accept that you have to explain the observer as well, then you can see that the nervous system operates as a closed system. And all the rest that I said becomes apparent. You become open to understanding of a situation in which you are also a participant. You cannot explain perception, cognition, self-consciousness, or language by treating the nervous system as an open system that receives information from the environment. There is no way in which you can do that. Now, this is a statement in this moment, of course, because there is no more time, but this is what I claim.
I'm sorry, we'll have to stop now, but thank you all very much for your questions for this part of today's video conference. I would like to end briefly by hoping that if we've been successful as cyberneticians, that there are more questions now than there were at the beginning. And in some sense, success is having the ability to have created a lot of questions. I would like to thank both Professor Heinz von Foerster and Professor Humberto Maturana, and you, the audience, and hope that this is the beginning of a lot of conversations about cybernetics for many of you. Thank you.